My roots as a gamer come from the polar opposite of what I play today, the era of the N64 and the PS1. My mind, like everyone else, would feel this really strong effect of interactivity and immersion that was unlike anything we had experienced before. Over the years, this effect would be replicated more and more, but every time the potency of it would be diluted due to the multitude of factors, like life, personal circumstances, change of perspective in gaming due to the growing trends in evolving technology, evidenced by what we saw in the 6th generation of console gaming, and eventually the HD era brought by the 7th generation of console gaming. But during that period, the PC also had its own bubble going on at the same time, but I wouldn't really notice it due to more of my time being spent on the PS2, replaying old racing games like Midnight Club 3, Need for Speed Most Wanted, Burnout 3, even one of Rockstar's earliest titles, Smuggler's Run, if anyone else remembers that. Not to mention other masterpieces like GTA San Andreas. But I would at times have some PC experience, where I would cut wood, collect cowhide near some goblins, near a bridge, wearing bronze armor. Anyway, me and my brother both shared the same computer, playing RuneScape, several Flash games, and at one point, Adventure Quest. It wasn't until late 2007 though that I would have full exposure to PC gaming, getting my own computer, along with a retail copy of Doom 3, the first Diablo, the orange box that contained Half-Life 2, Episode 1 and 2, Portal, and Team Fortress 2. Since then, I've been seeped into the world of PC gaming, but I've never really educated myself on its history for the most part, at least until now. I've been walking down the road of Retrovania, playing new games that look older, old games that still look older, and in the current climate, it's leaving a lot to be desired. People have been expressing a sense of fatigue, especially in the AAA scene despite some successful games as of late, which is why people have been going back in time, either for a nostalgia trip or growing curiosity. For this video, I'm exploring a gaming scene that was not as well known during its time, quite literally because of its exclusive nature. This is the PC-98, also known as the NEC PC-9800 series. From 1982 all the way up to the late 90s, the 9800 series would be born from the IBM equivalent that was the NEC. The 9800 series specifically was a range of 16 to 32-bit computers that would spread its seed into both domestic homes and corporate towers throughout the 80s in Japan. This was during the time where the idea of kilobytes and megabytes were considered a huge leap. 8 to 16 colors on the display was impressive, and that 640 by 400 pixel resolution was considered large. What is outdated now was prominent and new then, and the Japanese market would be exposed to the NEC's application of computer hardware and models, which it ruled with an iron fist. The PC-9800 series would be the dominating lineup of computers for home users and companies or corporations that would use their computers for business applications. The 98 series would build upon the impact of the NEC's earlier products, from the 6000 series, the 8000 and 8800 series. Those familiar with the 80s and 90s computer models would be able to see similarities on the surface, but within its hardware and software there would be big differences. However, in saying that, Western competitors would struggle greatly with opening a market within Japan due to the NEC's brand recognition and localization advantages. The 9800 series was applicable to a range of different operating systems over time, like the CP-M86, the concurrent CP/M, a localized version of MS-DOS that was different from the one that people in the West were familiar with, PC-UX, OS/2, and eventually Windows 95, that would also mark the beginning of the end for the PC-9800 series. 90s PC gaming was known to operate on the MS-DOS platform that was shared by many computer models across different companies in the West. Part of their efforts to get into the market of Japan was to localize their products in both different software applications as well as games. But it wasn't just the NEC's foothold within the market that prevented it for the most part, but the vast lineup of games that were an extension of the otaku culture as well as already having the equivalents for said applications. With the kanji character ROM. The kanji character ROM and the localized language for the NEC PC models would be the main reason why the West wasn't really exposed to the PC-98 market, due to already having a number of options that were already popular. And let's not forget, Fujitsu and Sharp already had their own lineup of PCs competing against the NEC. So all in all, it was a Japanese-dominated market where computers were made for and by Japanese people. It wasn't particularly easy getting one either at the time, unless you were living in Japan or were there for the sake of getting one, which in the West not a lot of people knew it even existed. One of many creations that the mass market of the West would never be exposed to. Nowadays though, you can find it online and order one, and they can either be incredibly cheap or incredibly expensive, depending on its condition or what it's labeled as. There are also retro stores in Japan that still sell working copies of the PC-98 models. As for most people though, they look towards emulation, like with the NEC project, where the creator has gone through a lot of effort and work to make the PC-98 games workable in digital form, as well as providing a depository for a number of games that were translated into English by a number of people. As for the fate of the PC-9800 series, and why they're not in circulation anymore, to summarize shortly, the release of Windows 95 and the growing number of PC-98 clones that provided cheaper prices with the same execution, and the architecture of the existing PC-98 hardware not being ready to transition into Windows 95, on top of increasing costs, eventually made the lineup obsolete. They did release the PC-98 NX series in '97, but the damage was already done, and they ultimately discontinued the production of the PC-9800 series in the early 2000s. By the end, over 18 million copies were sold as of 2004, and the last version of Windows to support the series was Windows 2000. However, like I said, computer hardware enthusiasts and retro stores are keeping remaining models and components in circulation, provided you know where to look. The same goes for the physical copies of the games released for it. PC-98 is a familiar territory for early PC gaming, but only as a result of the internet's evolution throughout the 2000s, and discoveries made by Western users that would come upon some of the games, most notably the Touhou series made by Zune. And looking at its library in contrast to many of the PC releases throughout the 90s on the MS-DOS platform, you have a completely different selection in the PC-98 realm. Like in the mediums of comics and animations as well as gaming, there were distinct differences in both cultural depictions of subjects and stylistic approaches to the animations and drawing styles. Not to mention the more taboo subjects that were viewed somewhat differently in Japan compared to Western audiences. And let's just get this out of the way, adult content in gaming. Gaming at this time was marketed towards kids in the West, and in Japan they were also a main target demographic. But Japan's relative indifference to the display of sexual content and nudity in media would pave the way for a number of either adult-themed games on the PC-98 or just straight-up hentai. This is something that would not have been tolerated in the US due to the way parents viewed gaming at the time, as well as how the media viewed it. In Japan though, it didn't really seem to matter too much due to the majority of the PC-98 library being revolved around adult content, but that's not to say that there weren't other options for different genres, especially if you were looking for non-adult content. The PC-98 library consisted of mainly JRPGs, visual novels, and bullet hell games that would stem from the birth of the Touhou project, which would become its own behemoth over time. And on the PC-98 would be one of the most popular games due to its addicting and fun gameplay, its incredible music, and its display of graphics, particles, and synergy between it and the player. Now, some games from the West, like I said, would also be ported onto the PC-98, but historically, Western gaming products and games have generally done poorly, like the Commodore 64 and later on, products like the Xbox, which may as well have not even been there at all. The games from the PC-98 expanded on what was done with the 8800 and its own lineup of games, having some honest-to-God impressive visuals for its time. Even games like this looked really good for their time too. The available hardware with each PC-98 lineup, even in spite of the existing hardware like the Sharp X68000 being superior, still found their way onto the PC-98 platform since it was the most popular one at the time. Now, when it came to more Western-based games, yes, the PC-98 had those too, like King's Bounty, Wolfenstein, Alone in the Dark, and yes, even Doom was on there as well. The access to these games was mainly due to the fact that the majority of PC-98 users were operating on a modified version of MS-DOS, with certain characteristics and differences that made it different to the one that we knew in the West, most notably the localization and not being IBM compatible. Not all Western games made it on their platform. Generally, the most successful releases would get a localization in Japan. In saying that though, they were still generally put aside in favor of the many visual novels, JRPGs, adventure games, and bullet hells that dominated the PC-98 spectrum of gaming. From a graphical standpoint, a lot of these games actually had some impressive art styles and graphics, even the erotica stuff like the Virgin Angel, that had a developed story and a well-made cyberpunk setting, among other things. Konami even had another high-profile game for it called Policenauts, a sci-fi detective story with some fantastic visuals and an engaging narrative. You had a plethora of visual novels ranging from drama to romance, to erotica to sci-fi and fantasy, and yes, hentai as well. You even had this game, which was like Resident Evil but in a visual novel format with some great zombie designs and overall visuals. The thing is though, for a lot of the visual novels, they were structurally the same, with similar UI and interactivity in the visual novel narrative. Once you played one or two, you've played them all. The things that set them apart were either the narrative or a visual novel that was actually Rule 34 in disguise. For the platformers, it had its own Castlevania clone called Rusty, except that instead of the bulky mass that is Simon Belmont, you had a dominatrix looking character that is quite literally whipping the demons, who look to have enjoyed it so much that they phased out of existence afterwards. Unfortunately though, there weren't really any FPS games made for the platform, and it's largely due to the fact that the Japanese demographic didn't really have any FPS games of their own, and seemed to favour other genres instead. The ones that were ported there, like Wolfenstein or Doom, have a fanbase in Japan the size of a high school classroom compared to the West where it was widely known and popular. You also had strategy or simulation games like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was one of the most popular games to have come out on the PC-9800, and the 98 would also get access to that game as well. Then finally you had the bullet hell games, also known as shmups or shoot 'em ups. Now, shoot-'em-up games were already around for a pretty long time, but Japan had its own spin on the scene, where the enemies and the bosses were shooting a metric ton of projectiles that would end up flooding the screen. Quite a few of them came out. Games like Rude Breaker, Flame Zapper, and Net Guardian provided the shoot-'em-up experience with lots of particles and different enemies with their own movement patterns. But one series would not only become the most iconic out of the library, but would spawn an entire franchise of its own, with its own universe that would journey to the West eventually, and become a big part of the anime fandom: Touhou. The Touhou series is huge in the anime world, and has been going strong since its inception in '97. The first game being highly responsive to prayers, made by Zune, the architect of the franchise, and would go on to make 18 games currently as we speak. The franchise itself has grown into its own pocket dimension, with a ton of other fan games, manga, and other forms of media. And unlike a lot of other trademarks and licenses, Zune is actually quite lenient with the Touhou trademark, provided that the creators of fan games, like say Touhou Lunar Nights, follow specific guidelines set by him. But as for the first 5 games released for the PC-98, well, 2 to 5 are the bullet hell shoot 'em ups that most Touhou fans are familiar with. But the first game was very different. Your character could only move from left to right, and had the yin and yang symbol being hit like a beach ball and shot at to keep it elevated, while manipulating its trajectory to hit the target. Most people would recommend not to start with this game first, but I personally didn't mind it. It doesn't feel as good as the later games though, that would expand on the concept and add more quality of life changes to each installment. The PC-98 releases were quite successful and became a fan favourite for the platform, but they were also made at the time when the platform was about to go into its twilight years, thanks to the release of Windows and other hardware with the architecture and support to integrate the new OS, effectively replacing the PC-98 and the NEC's dominance. Now, the significance of the PC-98 is rooted within its culture and its history. It had the brand recognition and loyalty behind the NEC, which was in a way like Japan's own IBM, another domineering brand over in the West. The Japanese PC market in the 80s was its own realm, made by and for Japanese people, and wouldn't really be discovered or appreciated by other people across the world for a long time. It pushed and evolved the local trends in Japan's PC gaming scene with updated graphics compared to the 8800 series, on top of better hardware that ran faster and would make room for continual development throughout the 90s. Its impact also extended beyond the gaming scene, which if you go further back to its beginnings, was actually exceeded by word processing applications and business applications used in corporate structures. Most of the home users during the 80s had primarily used a word processor, on top of other educational tools and miscellaneous software. They became, for a period of time, the go-to for corporate office spaces, and Fujitsu and Sharp would be climbing up Mount Everest throughout the 80s against the NEC. But eventually they'd get their break when Windows came along, breaking apart the monopoly that the NEC had for so long. But before it could do that, the PC-98 series game lineup would carry over to the new PCs that came onto the horizon, and the blueprints for that platform would be analysed and improved upon further. If you look to the 2000s era of the visual novels, the shoot 'em ups, the JRPGs, and even the RPG Maker games that would come out of the floodgates, you could see the parallels between them and the library of the PC-98 games. The games we saw drew its foundations from this platform, in the same way that the Windows-powered games in the 2000s drew upon the blueprints of the MS-DOS games in the 90s. The Touhou series would live on in Windows. The visual novels expanded on the PC-98's formula. The RPG Maker platform would bring back classic JRPG experiences also found on the PC-98. Its impact and legacy is remembered by those who lived in the country during its prime, and those within the hardware enthusiast community, as well as fans of visual novels and JRPGs. It's been resurrected more or less, but in digital form thanks to the NEC project and other emulators that digitize the PC-98 itself. But good luck finding most if not all of the games. And also, most of them haven't been translated to English since they were made specifically for the Japanese market at the time. It wasn't like with Nintendo or Konami, Squaresoft or Sony where they had successfully created a market in the West, leading to many localizations of their games. Not to mention the consoles such as the PlayStation and the N64 spearheading the games made by Japanese studios that were already pushing the technology of video games forward. The PC-98 couldn't make a market in the US because it was already occupied by other competitors like Microsoft, Apple, and IBM, which were like the Sharp, Fujitsu, and NEC of the US, that provided the same service, and their game lineup was a stark contrast compared to what was being released in Japan. In saying that though, the PC-98's library is quite unique because of how exclusive a lot of the games feel compared to most of the MS-DOS games that were made for a wider range of audiences. But today though, they're for everyone now due to accessibility using emulators as well as getting access to such a product through retro stores or through online marketplaces. The West saw the rise and fall of the MS-DOS era of gaming, and roughly at the same time the era of the PC-98 had also met the same fate. Technology is like history, it's left behind but some of us preserve it, as it provides a link to the past and gives us insight into a world that was once before. And the world of the PC-98 was an isolated bubble that made its own marks in the advancement of personal computing and game development. Only it did it for its own people and not for the world. It's a great platform that had managed to shape and influence the development of hardware and software throughout the 80s up until the late 90s, integrating itself into homes and corporate environments all the same. Its game selection is somewhat limited but also unique due to its reflection of its exclusive audience and also its leniency and open approach to adult content, due to being viewed as an artistic expression in Japan, something that would never have been allowed in the US. It's an era of PC gaming that has for the most part been lost to time, and it's not exactly easy to get into. Not when the MS-DOS is more accessible by comparison. I would, however, recommend that you look into this side of PC gaming, seeing another perspective of early PC gaming but from the other side of the world that was doing the same thing, but with a few characteristics that set it apart entirely from its Western counterpart. I'll provide some links in the description regarding the PC-98 so you can check it out. Thank you for watching.
You want that piece? Okay, Maggie, look. Let me break it down to you how it's gonna happen. They're gonna come through that door and be good cop, bad cop. Don't fall for that, all right? That's why I ate their food. So they put the plate of donuts out here to test your guilt. If you don't touch it, you're guilty. I ate the whole plate. The whole plate. Okay? It's me and you. They walk through that door, you don't say nothing.
Cartoons, playing video games with my cousin, and she came in there. All right? Hey, I am not going to jail for you or anybody else. I have done nothing bad my entire life. Hey, man, I'm still a virgin.